If you wish, we can consider divorce, but I'd like to continue living with our son." Despite John berating me extensively, he looked satisfied as he took a deep breath. I pondered how to respond, and our son, who had been waiting in the background, stepped forward. "Dad, if you don't know, let me tell you," our son said, pointing at his father's mistress. His words made me break into a cheeky smile. "My name is Jennifer. I turned 42 this year, currently working as a freelance illustrator. We've been married for 15 years, and we have a son in 8th grade. Throughout our marriage, John has jumped from job to job, not lasting very long. Most of our income comes from my work as I balance housework, raising our child, and my job. Working from home became a necessity as John took sporadic short-term jobs. Despite being a newbie in the freelance world initially, my efforts resulted in a stable income and consistent work. Referrals from former clients led to new projects, and I now illustrate educational magazines and brochures. With David growing up, I managed to work from home and go out for work a few times a week. The three of us lived harmoniously, but John's lack of direction troubled me. At 44, he seemed content with his aimless life, rarely working full-time. Despite having free time, he didn't contribute much to housework or child raising. John's disinterest in our son David, who was entering his challenging teenage years, frustrated me. David, although not very talkative, occasionally helped with chores without being asked. However, John showed no interest in our son and rarely assisted with household responsibilities. Lately, John had been coming home late more often, and I couldn't shake off my unease and frustration. Even on days when he claimed to be working, I suspected he might be doing something else. His sudden interest in picking up and dropping off David at his basketball club raised suspicions, as it contradicted our household rule of always having a parent handle these tasks. While I appreciated the help, something felt off, and my suspicions started to crystallize over the past few months. As I passed by the place where David goes, I decided to take a different route home for a change of scenery. While shopping near David's facility, I unexpectedly spotted John, who wasn't supposed to be there. He had claimed he'd be late tonight due to out-of-town work. To my surprise, he was chatting happily with a woman who appeared to be one of the staff members from the basketball facility. A sense of unease washed over me as I observed the two of them. The woman noticed me and tilted her head, asking, "Excuse me, are you David's mom?" I reluctantly confirmed, and she thanked me for my son being in her care. Awkwardly nodding, I engaged in small talk with her, curious about her role at the facility. Ignoring my husband, who seemed rigid and tense, I attempted to gather information. The woman introduced herself as Jessica, but I couldn't help but wonder why she didn't provide more details about her role with David. Ignoring my puzzled expression, my husband seemed eager to end their conversation. On the way home, we didn't speak, and he deliberately avoided eye contact, appearing distant. His recent late returns and eagerness to handle drop-offs and pickups, combined with his strange behavior after being spotted, fueled my suspicions. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica had something to do with it. As we walked home, I wondered if he was having an affair with this younger woman. In my heart, I sensed a change since he began doing the drop-offs and pickups. He had become noticeably distant, and when I inquired about his behavior, our son responded curtly, displaying annoyance. Chasing after our reluctant son and forcing him to the facility every day felt wrong. My suspicions grew, and soon they were confirmed. One day, as I casually dropped by, Jessica found excuses to visit our home more frequently. While she mentioned our son, it became clear that it was just a pretext. She always appeared when my husband was home, not me or our son. Watching them cheerfully converse in the living room, I was certain of John's infidelity. A month after noticing odd behavior, my husband began coming home later and occasionally leaving for days. When I jokingly remarked about his late return, suggesting he spare me the cheating, he abruptly stood up and glared at me. "Just stick to your work. I'm taking care of David, so don't pry into it unnecessarily," he retorted before leaving the living room with a sigh. I seethed with anger at being told as if he was handling everything, when in reality, he had left all the housework and the responsibility of taking care of David to me. My frustration surfaced during one of our petty disputes, and David, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up. "What's the matter, Mom?" David questioned, having noticed the tension. Trying to downplay it, I asked about him and why he was up at that hour. David, stepping out of his room, stared at me before hesitantly sharing his observations about a female staff member he suspected to be his father's mistress. According to David, this woman, Jessica, would frequently approach him at the facility, annoying him with her clinginess. He felt frustrated that she had started coming to our house, a sentiment I shared. It was evident that my son disliked having someone from his basketball club imposing on our home, providing me with a sense of relief. However, the problem persisted. Returning home from a client meeting, I heard cheerful conversation in the living room, the voices of John and Jessica. David was noticeably absent, holed up in his room. Upon entering the living room, both John and Jessica turned their eyes toward me. Jessica, with unwavering confidence, greeted me. "Welcome back, David's mom." I ran into John, so he invited me in, Jessica said, addressing my husband by his name, a fact that deeply unsettled me. Attempting sarcasm, I inquired about her frequent meetings with John, to which she responded with a smug face, claiming it was part of her job. Her audacity continued as she pointed out the deficiencies in my housekeeping, expressing that the house felt cozy but lacked thorough cleaning. My husband didn't rebuff her comments and even chuckled along, seemingly siding with Jessica. Although I worked from home, I felt self-conscious about not keeping up with housework. However, if he contributed more to chores and childcare, it wouldn't be an issue. Feeling mocked and ridiculed, unable to bear the tension, I hastily left the living room for the bedroom, still holding my belongings. Frustration, sadness, and embarrassment overwhelmed me. I feared that Jessica might eventually take over my place in the family. Even after that encounter, my husband and Jessica continued their outings, displaying their relationship in front of me, leaving me speechless. I later learned from others that they often met under the guise of discussing my son's education, further deepening my sense of betrayal. Realizing the need for evidence during my husband's frequent absences, I embarked on a search that uncovered undeniable proof of his infidelity. Despite his claims that we couldn't afford gifts for birthdays or anniversaries, I stumbled upon receipts from motels, upscale restaurants, and high-end watches and jewelry in his coat pocket. Even places he insisted were beyond our financial reach had receipts, suggesting he frequented them with his mistress, not his wife. While the pain of his actions cut deep, I maintained composure and continued accumulating evidence of his affairs. Though divorce crossed my mind, I resolved to endure until David graduated from high school. Yet I vowed to gather sufficient evidence to secure a favorable position if the time for separation came. The question lingered. Where was the money for his affair coming from? As I pondered, I remembered our house's savings account for my son's college fund. A chill ran down my spine as I checked the transactions, revealing substantial withdrawals over the past few months. Shockingly, the balance had significantly decreased. The money meant for our son's education was being used for his selfish needs. The betrayal against our child overshadowed the betrayal against me as his wife. Suppressing my anger, I chose to act normal, not wanting our impressionable son to sense the brewing storm. I carried the burdens alone, trying not to burden our son who was studying diligently. However, stress took its toll, leading to small mistakes in household chores and at work. Even longtime client Mrs. Smith noticed my worn-out state, expressing concern and offering comfort. While I struggled, my husband reveled in his affair, seemingly more relaxed without my interference. Eventually, our son, David, would inevitably confront the issues within our family. Observing my downtrodden demeanor, David silently approached to help with household tasks. "I kind of know what's going on, huh?" he said, folding laundry. "Do whatever you want to do, Mom. You don't have to worry about me." His thoughtful actions, though sparing in words, warmed my heart and intensified my anger toward the traitor who touched the money reserved for our son's future. Retribution for this betrayal became a necessity. Contemplating whether to reach out to the person who had promised support, I weighed the options before me. With clenched fists, I vowed vengeance on my husband and his mistress. One evening, he suddenly announced a week-long work trip for training in another state. However, skepticism arose. The restaurant chain he worked for operated solely within our state, with no offices outside. His earlier boast about the job's perks included not having to relocate out of state. When my son casually mentioned a staff member from his club taking a week off, my husband's startled expression raised suspicions. Despite his initial pride in discussing the intense training, he grew silent and stared anxiously at his smartphone. Since confirming his infidelity, I had been monitoring both him and Jessica. A private investigator revealed that Jessica, working at the basketball facility, also had a week off. Aware that their business trip was a cover for a romantic getaway, I refrained from catching them red-handed, opting for a more strategic plan. Having planned something since discovering their intentions, I coordinated with my son, who was now on board. On the day of their trip, I bid farewell to my unsuspecting husband. My son and I, aided by relatives, began cleaning and packing. The plan was to move out while he was away and stay elsewhere until finding a new home. Supported by relatives angered by his actions yet concerned for David, to prevent my husband's access to our savings account, I transferred the remaining money to my personal account. While making preparations, I couldn't leave his belongings behind and decided to send them to a specific location with Mrs. Smith's consent. A few days after moving, my phone rang with my husband in a panic, requesting money during his supposed training. Declining, I confronted him about the account he usually withdrew from. The frantic voice of Jessica in the background signaled their financial desperation. The next day, my son and I headed to a specific location, a magnificent mansion with a well-maintained garden. Inside, we found my cheating husband and his mistress, sitting on the floor, apologizing to Mrs. Smith. She, with a stern expression, was not just a longtime client, but also the principal of the middle school attended by my son, forging a close relationship over the years. We confide in each other with our personal troubles. I'm deeply sorry for the trouble caused by my husband. In truth, it's my daughter's fault that all of this happened. It turned out that Jessica, who was on a trip with my husband, was questioned by her parents about a package she received at home and had no choice but to return immediately. Naturally, she insisted that my husband accompany her. Upon hearing Mrs. Smith's words, my husband began to shake in fear. Mrs. Smith had always been concerned about my declining health after learning about John's affair. When I finally confided in her about the affair and she discovered that the mistress was her daughter, she was utterly devastated. Despite this, Mrs. Smith wanted to make amends for her daughter's actions and had been cooperating with me ever since. Pointing at the piles of boxes, she sternly reprimanded her daughter, expressing her disappointment. "You should be ashamed of yourself for always wanting what isn't yours," Mrs. Smith scolded her daughter sternly. Her daughter attempted to defend herself, claiming it was a misunderstanding, but Mrs. Smith wouldn't hear it. She insisted on an apology, promising consequences for her daughter's actions. Ignoring Jessica's hysterics, I turned my attention to my silent husband standing beside her. "Don't you have something to say to me?" I asked sharply, prompting David, who had been standing behind me, to step forward. "She's not a regular staff there, just an intern at the club," David interjected firmly, addressing Jessica directly. "And don't you ever try to get all chummy with me again. Always flirting with men. It's disgusting." As my son spoke, it became clear that Jessica hadn't been officially hired at the club, contrary to my husband's belief. He had thought she was experienced in student education or activities, which was laughable considering her actual status. Their exchange revealed hidden truths, and as I looked at the stunned Jessica, it seemed that they both had their secrets. Before leaving, I felt compelled to offer Jessica a piece of advice. "Did you know that I pay for the rent, living expenses, and even David's tuition fees? This man, John, has been working odd jobs for years. You think he's okay?" Jen, with a face drained of color, attempted to interject, but it was too late. Jessica was so shocked by the revelation that she collapsed on the spot. From what I could tell, John had been acting as if he had plenty of money to spare, hiding the fact that I was the breadwinner of the family to save face in Jessica's eyes. I seemed like a lazy bum who neither worked nor took care of household chores properly. Mrs. Smith was left devastated, facing the harsh reality presented by my husband and Jessica. After David and I happily returned home, it appeared that John was kicked out of Mrs. Smith's house. Looking defeated with Jessica and a load of stuff, months passed since the move. On Mrs. Smith's advice, I decided to leave my divorce process to a competent lawyer. Thanks to professional assistance, all the complicated procedures went smoothly, bringing me relief. I heard that the savings I had set aside for David's education could also be added to the claim as child support. As for Jessica, rumors spread quickly at the basketball club about her affair with a student's parent, leading to her dismissal from the job. Seeking help from her parents, Jessica found Mrs. Smith unwilling to assist, leaving her lost and confused. Despising a man without money, she spat out words of disdain and abandoned John. Despite John's attempts at reconciliation, neither David nor I were willing to agree. Mrs. Smith felt terribly guilty for her daughter's role in ruining a family. I held the downcast principal's hand and said, "Let's keep working together." I'm truly grateful for the principal, thanks to whom I found a new job. Work has been going smoothly, and life with just David and me is filled with hope. David's joyful smile touched my heart as he casually expressed, "The job you do, Mom, is really amazing. You're the mom I'm proud of." Looking at a magazine featuring my illustrations, I discreetly wiped a tear from my eye. I want to keep pursuing my career as an illustrator, but above all, I want to work even harder for my precious David.